Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by James Lawrence to discuss power, the perennialist theory of democracy, and the black pill, amongst other things. Just like to thank James for joining us today. And so, James, a lot of your writing on the Affirmative Right blogspot, a lot of it is about power. How would you go about defining, what is your concept of power in your writing?
Okay. First of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. And with regards to power, when I use so there's power. I think in my writing on the Affirmative Right blog, perhaps you'll find power with a capital P and power with a small p. And sort of power with a capital P is the Juvenal's definition of power. Juvenal's definition of power, which is the central authority in a political order, basically the what we call the state. And as for the nature of the power that it wields, I mean, this question is very relevant to the present day, because in theory, in democratic theory, power comes from everyone. So power comes from the consent of the governed, and the people are invested with the power to change their government, and by voicing their discontent and getting rid of bad governance. And yet we've seen, as we can see, we've had last year, all through the summer, we've had violent BLM riots, burning entire cities, assaulting people, and these have been, supposedly we can see them changing public opinion. Everyone is the ostensible cause of the riots. George Floyd was practically turned into a saint, and supposedly Black Lives Matter is influencing people by this book. And yet we've seen the storming of the Capitol, this horrible, evil right-wing coup, this attempted right-wing coup. We've seen other people trying to exercise power in the same way, and they're being cracked down upon. It's not worked out for them at all. So what we need to look at, I think, is the network. One of these groups has patronage on their side and the other does not. And the two kinds, and basically, when you see this kind of, we see a lot of popular rebellion, ostensible popular rebellion in society, but often when it's left-wing popular rebellion, we will find strings of patronage leading up to the state, and we generally, when it's coming from the right, we will not see that. So looking at that state, I'd say there's always two kinds of power involved in it. So one of those would be the political power, the monopoly of the ability to exercise force, to monopolize violence. But then there's another side of it, which is religious authority, and I'm using the term religion in the widest possible sense here. And essentially, the religion, and this is the theory of Moldbug, Mencius Moldbug, that the West, the democratic West, basically has a secular religion, which we can call progressivism. He gives it various names, but basically, if you're this religion is sort of generated in academia, and it serves the sort of the power, the expansion of the bureaucracy, which is another locus of power, and it's sort of propagated down the social order by the media. So if you sort of try to sort of exercise power from outside that structure, sort of as ordinary people, sort of if that power structure is on your side, and especially the religious authority, it will basically turn off the political power that would normally oppose you and stamp you down. So you can see sort of people, for example, like organizations like BLM, what appear to be ordinary people, sort of using power, taking power. But what you're seeing there is a kind of really a patron-client relationship, and the kind of power we need to look at here is the power in the sort of in the ruling class, in the ruling class is the state, which is religious authority and political power. And I've probably gone on for a bit too long there, so I'll hand over to you.
What's your view of theorists like David Hume and I can never pronounce his name properly, Le Bossuet, who argue that the sort of power of the state effectively rests on the consent of the governed, which you might think is sort of like in a sense, sort of like a proto sort of democratic approach, in that, well, the only power that the central authorities have kind of just comes from the people as a whole. The argument being that if everyone just decided not to obey, so like for example, let's take lockdowns. If the entire population said, well, who weren't sort of direct state employees decided that, well, no, we're just going to ignore it and we'll just do what we want, then the idea is that then the state would basically have no authority and basically then have no power. Is that view sort of consistent with the way you approach things, or would you, or how would you differentiate yourself from that kind of view if you were to do so?
Well, the second of those thinkers, which I can't pronounce his name either. One thing you notice about him is he's basically saying no one man, no tyrant, no single man can possibly hold all of society in subjection by himself. So if everyone decided not to obey him, then he would have no power, which is certainly true insofar as we're talking about this one man who is essentially powerless. But when we have to break down sort of who we're talking about, who is going to do the resisting here, and in this case we sort of have to identify a kind of stratification into classes here, because the idea that sort of one man, the fact that one man cannot do anything without other people to help him, was actually it's part of Mosca's Gaetano Mosca's theory of power, which is that all power is essentially reducible to oligarchy. Because what he said is when you have one person in power, that person requires a group of people around him to carry out his will. Without them, he cannot do anything. And again, this is relevant to the present day, because we have seen Donald Trump tried to make his will felt for 4 years, and more or less completely failing to do that. Although theoretically he is the leader he is he's presiding over the government supposedly, but the bureaucracy, who are the relevant people here, they will not do what he says. They will resist him at every turn. They openly resist him, and the media, another locus of power, the journalists, so that class also resist him, so he can't get anything done. So here we have sort of an instance again of successful resistance to someone who supposedly is in power. But again, it's rather different when we're talking about the general mass of the population trying to resist the will of the ruling class, because as long as that ruling class can command superior force, and as long as it's the ruling class is smaller and generally going to be more cohesive than the general mass of the population, the vast majority of people are going to comply with that, as we've seen with the lockdowns, and how there's a very sort of there's a lot of difficulty in kind of getting together enough people to resist it. Sort of, if you could coordinate everyone to resist at once, then perhaps you could get something done. But again, how do you sort of have the ability to coordinate them? The sort of the human social technology that coordinates all of these people at once is basically the state. So if that's against you, you kind of don't really have a way to do that. So that's my answer to this, to your question there.
I thought you might go that way. It does seem to be that the problem with the busway's view is coordination, and that because unless you can get a significant minority to not comply, then you're going to be small enough to be beaten down by violence, basically. So whilst in the Moldbug's theory, with the legitimization of the sort of clerical oligarchy that currently exists, is kind of based in a sense around consent in certain respects, because it's clerical, and they get their authority from the elite educational institutions, which we'll probably get onto later. Yes, there is still that sort of power, sort of violent power dynamic there, which if it wasn't there, then they would have significantly less sort of power in a more general sense than they currently have. So would you then say, so one of the things you said in your writing is that the power flows downwards. Could you elaborate on what you exactly mean by that, please?
Possibly my phrasing there was a bit confusing, because all I really mean there is that if I look back at what I wrote there, okay, power must flow downwards. Okay, all I really mean there is the sort of the force is going to come from the ruling class, the ruling political body, and be exercised upon the people. Basically, all I mean there, and I think I also said something like I think I also said there, tax must flow upwards, power must flow downwards. So essentially, this is a sort of, what I'm saying is that there's a kind of universal relation here, whereby the people, the large mass of people who work, who produce, they pay the ruler, the ruling class, the ruling political body to do their own sort of, to carry out their own unproductive role, and that role is telling them what to do. So all I really mean there is who's telling who what to do, more or less, is quite simple, I think.
Okay, that clarifies it. So that moves on quite nicely then to the idea of democracy and one of your recent essays, I think relatively recent, was on the what you entitled the perennialist theory of democracy, taking your insights from a lot of Moldbug's long essay that I can't exactly remember the title of. So could you just recapitulate what your perennialist theory of democracy is for the listeners, please?
Okay, I don't know if your listeners are. I don't know how familiar your listeners are with Moldbug, but I think if you're going to read sort of what I wrote there, it's kind of an extension of Moldbug's theory. And Moldbug's so I'll just sort of briefly go into what Moldbug thinks first of all. Moldbug's viewpoint, he says, as you touched upon, Moldbug says that the true form of government, the true form of government that we have is not democracy but clerical oligarchy, and this is what he's saying is the centers of academia. So he talks a lot about Harvard. Essentially, academia acts as a kind of state church. It acts as a state church, and its ideas are sort of propagated to the masses through the media, and this is where the bureaucracy get their ideas. And this is where sort of if the media, for example, declares, say, let's say someone like Donald Trump comes into office, and the media declares him persona non grata, the bureaucrats are going to resist his will, and when it comes to election time, they're going to do everything they can by hook or by crook to get him out. And of course the media tells the people what to think. The people then are entrusted with the right to vote. So they, well, up until relatively recently, they did vote more or less as the media tells them to. So the theory I have there, the issue I take with Moldbug on that, is that he sort of takes the official story of democracy very seriously, and what you'll see if you look at sort of take even a cursory glance at any political theory, you'll see this kind of truism that sort of direct democracy is not possible in the modern era. Sort of Athenian democracy was direct democracy, and now we have something called representative democracy, which is just another kind of democracy. But if you look back sort of into some of the history of political thought, even sort of writers who are like Rousseau, who are seen as having sort of paved the way to the kind of understanding that we have now, the kind of democratic ideology. They don't really believe in this representative democracy, and it's a very tenuous idea. In the idea that you can alienate your power to representatives, that kind of puts the representatives in control, right? And the idea that I have with the when I say that when I use the term perennialist theory of democracy, by perennialist, all I'm trying to achieve there is to come up with a theory that sort of links ancient democracy with modern democracy, to try to get back to a definition of democracy that can sort of be used anywhere, that doesn't sort of, because at present this term democracy refers to such wildly different forms of government as Athenian democracy, where the people, the citizens, actually rule the state directly, and this sort of democracy that we have here, where the voters elect so-called representatives, and so on. And what I'm saying here in the post that you mentioned is that we do in fact have a kind of direct democracy, but the vast majority of people are not citizens in it. And what I mean here is essentially the various people. Sorry, I'm not putting this very well. The classes who purport to the classes that purport to represent the wider mass of the people are, in fact, a demos, a ruling citizenry in their own right, and the reason why I say they're a democracy is because this term, I think, refers to the rule of a multitude. Okay, so democracy, the rule of the people, doesn't have to mean the rule of everyone, because by that definition, ancient Athens would not be a democracy, because more people in Athens were non-citizens than were citizens, and of course only half of the citizens, the male half, had the political rights. Okay, so the idea I have here is that all of the academic media complex, so what Moldbug calls the cathedral, and then the bureaucracy, and then the various political classes, which are not just the elected politicians, but also the lobbyists, also the sort of professional political activists. And when we talk about the bureaucracy, we also have to remember that goes well beyond the official civil service in any sort of given Western country. That sort of extends into this huge sort of pool of quangos. No one really knows the extent of this sort of ruling. What I call the ruling, the demos, the true demos of democracy. But I would say sort of it is subject to no higher authority. No one's telling it what to do. It's sort of the cathedral produces sort of religious justifications for what it does, but by religious you can say ideological, intellectual, all really quite synonymous. The cathedral produces the religious justification, but that also serves the power interest of the bureaucracy. So sort of the expansion justifies giving bureaucrats lots of work, lots of power, and then the political classes kind of mobilize the population in a kind of civil war to sort of, to my mind, this is a kind of deliberative assembly of sorts, a sort of combative assembly where the demos kind of decides how far it's going to expand and what it's going to do. So this is how I would say that democracy really works in the modern era. But I'm sure you've got a lot of questions there, so I'll hand over to you.
I might add, do you think democracy is one of those terms that I've never really could get a sound definition on from political scientists, or, I mean, of course, Aristotle has the rule of the many, as opposed to oligarchy and monarchy, of course. But if you point to historical examples, I mean, even Noam Chomsky, for example, even though he's an advocate of democracy, he himself is well aware the United States is not a democracy. You can get that in his book, Manufacturing Consent. That's one of the which I think fine. And, your point about how by modern standards, the definition, almost no historical society is close to being a democracy. I mean, and even then, of the citizenry, it's only the citizens that have enough leisure time or enough free time. So by modern standards, almost no society is a democracy. So democracy is one of those words that I would argue, other than meaning something simple like the rule of the many, has never existed historically. And today it's just a sort of ideological feel-good word. We're going to democratize something. So as far as democracy itself, would you agree with that clarification that it's never really existed by this sort of modern definition of the word, the rule by the many? And as far as the if you could make a more sound, if you had a sound definition, would you basically agree with Aristotle? I mean, I can define a chair as something that has four legs and something you can sit on. You can come up with definitions of certain things. I'm not denying the ability to do that necessarily, but what would be your rough definition of democracy there, James?
Okay, I agree with you that as it's presently used, this word democracy, what the hell does it mean? I mean, this is precisely sort of what I'm trying to get at, and I actually find it very very difficult to explain, surprisingly difficult to try to sort of nail this word down to mean something to mean something that makes sense. As for rule of the many, I have to admit I do not speak Greek, but I think the word used for that is a pletos, as in plethora, and I think that I think that kind of referred to like the poorer sort of mass of Athenian citizens, of enfranchised citizens in Athens or another democratic city, but not to everyone. Because it didn't refer to the slaves or non-citizens. So I think we could understand democracy. I think the way to understand democracy is because, as you say, it can't possibly exist. The rule of everyone ruling. Everyone ruling themselves or everyone ruling everyone else. It doesn't refer to any kind of reality. So I think the definition I would use is to try to sort of make a bit more sense is rule of the multitude, rule of the multitude, rule of a multitude. So I would say an oligarchy, for example, if a parliament, for example, if parliaments like the British Parliament actually did rule the country, and the sort of the civil service was entirely subordinate to them, and the press, the cathedral, didn't sort of control them more than it controls them. Sort of if Parliament worked as advertised, that would be an oligarchy. I would say that's simply because there is a kind of limited number of people ruling, whereas and that would make things very different, because they're limited. If you have enough people to fit in a parliament, they can deliberate, they can debate. So I think it's kind of a truism nowadays that parliamentary debates sort of don't. You don't really see any great oratory. No one really puts effort into really persuading people in parliamentary debates. But in the days when Parliament really did rule, in Britain at least, this sort of great oratory was very important. Sort of persuading people, because you could actually get things done that way. And the rule of the multitude, it is kind of more dependent on, well, as we can see with the handling of the coronavirus situation, this government, this form of government, kind of has no idea what to do. It gets sort of an obsession in its collective mind, and it kind of acts very irrationally. And that's something that you can also see in the history of democracy in Athens. You can see sort of the Athenian assembly kind of doing one thing one day and then countermanding what it did the next day, and sort of just flip-flopping back and forth, and basically having no idea what to do. And another thing that might help is the thing I mentioned, Mosca, his idea that all government can be reduced to oligarchy. So to get anything done in government, to move remove the levers of government, you need a sort of a group of people. You need a group of ruling elites who can then sort of who can get things done, who can pass who can pass sort of exercise power, and if there's a monarchy, for example, or if there's a wider group of people voting for them, they can pass orders on to the people who are in various parts of government. What we could say is the basic form of government is an oligarchy. We could then superimpose Aristotle's monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, and democracy onto that. So we could say that a monarchy, in reality, it's not one man ruling everything. It's not one man sort of doing everything by his own will, but it's an oligarchy that kind of centers on a single individual. In terms of sort of a formal oligarchical government, we could say that is an oligarchy ruling by itself, in which sort of the members of that oligarchy would have to have their own power bases, would have to sort of they're not dependent on someone giving them orders from above. And in the case of sort of democracy, direct democracy, we could say it's sort of like a constellation of little oligarchies, almost like a chaos of various little governments all fighting for dominant, well, not dominant such, but power, fighting for power and trying to expand their sort of their influence. One more thing is, when we use the word democracy, we're kind of referring to the idea of popular sovereignty, which is essentially, I would say, this is a kind of almost like a religious ritual, or almost a kind of a religious concept, which sort of hinges on the ritual of sort of giving the public a choice and giving the electorate a choice and letting them vote for it, letting them vote either way. But this doesn't really have much to do with, well, it does in certain contexts have a lot to do with it, but the actual running of government is what we should be looking at when we use the term power or kratos. Okay, I'll hand back over to you.
Oh, that's great. I would largely agree there. Would you go as far as to say that? So would you say one of the things I like about Hans Hoppe, for example, is his pointing out in his praxeological lectures is, what is basically, oxymorons or contradictions. And one of them is like a married bachelor or a four-sided triangle. Would you go as far as say as democracy itself is a four-sided triangle? Because rule of the many, rule of the many, I would argue, is anarchism. Which to me is fine. If everyone's making decisions about themselves, that's just anarchism of some variety. Now, of course, how do people organize en masse? Then you get into the left anarchists, right anarchists, and so forth. But that's one thing I like about Keith Preston, for example, is he has a great essay, Attack the System, on he views anarchism as the John Locke to anarchism pathway. I see that trajectory as well, myself as well. Not myself, but now the question is, can anarchism actually work? And I think Moldbug would obviously say no way. Someone needs to be ruled, and so forth. And this goes into deeper waters. But would you largely agree that would you go too far as say that democracy is like one of those words? Because historically, of course, the modern democratic theorists would argue that most historical societies aren't. And if you ask certain left-wingers, for example, they'll say that we currently live. What do Moldbug and Noam Chomsky both. Someone wrote a critical essay about Moldbug from some like left liberal publication, and he said, they both agree that U.S. is an oligarchy. So would you go to so far that like democracy is, somewhat impossible, James?
Well, yes, as if we take it as meaning sort of rule of the majority, rule of the many, as in rule of sort of everyone or almost everyone, then yes, it is impossible, I would say. But as rule of a multitude, which I'd say is an alternative meaning of rule of the many, I don't think that is impossible. And as for whether it devolves into anarchy, this is another sort of this is another important point. It really depends on what kind of society you have, because ancient Athens, of course, was able to have rule of the citizens, rule of the many, rule of the multitude, and it didn't work very well, according to most of the thinkers we respect. Nowadays, Socrates, Plato did not think much of it, and yeah, we can see sort of from the history sort of how it fought the war with Sparta, for example. It did not work very well, but it did work. It basically worked.
I'm just going to butt in for 1 second. Even Rousseau thought poorly of democracy. He thought it only could work in small communities. So yeah.
That's kind of what I'm getting at here. Yeah, this is the sort of this is what we tend to hear about direct democracy. We can't have it now. It's an impossibility because we don't live in a small city-state where everyone can kind of gather together in the center of the city or wherever, in the meeting place, and basically have a debate. It's interesting to look at the example of of Poland, the Polish Commonwealth. So the early modern Polish Commonwealth in the sort of 16th to 18th centuries was what I would say that is the sort of the closest you can. I would call that an example of a democracy by my definition, in the sense that it was ruled by a multitude. It wasn't ruled by everyone, because it was ruled by its nobility, its noble class. The Polish nobility were called the Szlachta, and they were about, I think, 10% of the population. That may possibly more in Poland proper, because also Lithuania was annexed to it, but around 10% of the population, which still made them very large nobility by European standards, because it's sort of 10 times as large as other European nobilities of the time. And essentially they had total authority. They had an elective monarch. They elected the monarch. Not the monarch, the king. They elected a king, but the king sort of had a laundry list of sort of Szlachta privileges that he wasn't allowed to infringe, otherwise he would forfeit his crown. And they had the army. They had a levée en masse. That was their means of defense. Basically, the Szlachta band together and turned into an army, and essentially they were sovereign in their own on their own lands. They had a kind of tenure which was not feudal. It was they had allodial tenure, which meant they could totally control their lands. They didn't hold it in fief from anyone higher than them in a sort of feudal hierarchy. So they ran, and Poland at this time, it called itself a republic, but it had such a weak central government, and sort of this multitude of Szlachta this noble multitude were ruling it. So by my definition, rule of the multitude, I would say that is a democracy. Yes. So this was essentially ruled. Yeah, it was ruled by. It had no sort of little central government, ruled by its nobility, which was a teeming multitude, and by my definition, I would say this is an example of a kind of an early modern democracy. But the thing about Poland is it fell into anarchy in the end and became it could not defend itself against its enemies, sort of Prussia, Sweden, Russia, were sort of menacing it. All of these countries have become more absolutist, while Poland had become more and more sort of less and less centralized, and they ended up sort of Prussia, Russia, and Austria obviously ended up sort of partitioning it and wiping it off the map. And the reason for that, I think, would be that the kind of society, the kind of society that Poland was, it was too decentralized for rule of a multitude to work. It was essentially a decentralized territorial state, ruled by a noble class who could not sort of gather in one place, and sort of like the Athenian citizenry, it couldn't gather in one place and sort of deliberate and get things done. And what I think has happened in the West, sort of in the modern era, is we have gone from that kind of decentralized sort of landed aristocracy, political order, to a central order, a centralized political order in which we have a sort of scholarly bureaucratic class at the center. And obviously this is essentially in whether they are in academia or in journalism or in the bureaucracy, which is kind of the core of the government, certainly in Moldbug's theory. This is essentially a scholarly class, sort of at the center of power, and this class, I would say, is capable of exercising the direct rule of a multitude in a way that a landed aristocracy couldn't, and that also goes for the bourgeoisie. Bourgeois class could not sort of exercise that kind of that kind of central rule. So I think sort of direct democracy has become possible in the West in the modern era, but the problem is it doesn't work very well, and most of us are not citizens in this democracy. So the democratic freedom that we try to sort of use to our own purposes, we like the idea of democratic freedom, but it's really the freedom. The reality of democratic freedom in the West is the freedom of this sort of demos, as I call it, this sort of relatively small percentage of the population to rule us, to tax us, to make law, to regulate us. So really, I'm afraid, this freedom really has nothing to do with us.
Well, how did the clerical oligarchy, as Moldbug describes them, come to have so much prominence in the Western governments? Would it be the case that you think that whenever you have a sort of complex bureaucracy or formal, large-scale formal governance structures, that you always tend towards clericalism of some description? Is it true that sort of ideas, as it were, ultimately matter, and therefore the ultimate idea makers are the clerical authorities of any sort of nation or group? And secondly, as you mentioned before, the sort of legitimizing ideology of the current ruling order is what you might call progressivism, or as Keith Preston calls it, totalitarian humanism. How did that come about? How did we go from sort of like a society which was historically more focused on collective action and the good of the local group or the nation, to one that sort of attempts to justify itself on individual rights and expressive individualism in general? So that was quite a lot. So the first question was, do states tend towards clerical oligarchies in general? And secondly, how do we get the current form of clerical oligarchy that we presently have?
Okay, so for the first part, I think you mentioned you're asking whether a modern centralized state would tend towards clerical rule. Well, arguably, sort of clerical. I don't really use Moldbug's term clerical oligarchy, but sort of the rule of a clerical class is it kind of goes way back, long before sort of long before the sort of modern centralized state. So sort of in medieval Europe, sort of there was a long-running dispute, a long-running struggle for power between the empire and the church, and the so-called Holy Roman Empire. And theoretically, these were sort of two powers: the church, the papacy. It wasn't originally the papacy, but the church basically dealing with spiritual matters, and the empire dealing with temporal matters. That's not really how it worked, though, because the church basically ended up just making itself the top sort of temporal power. So you can see, for example, in the Crusades, it was the Pope who would give the order, and sort of armies would go off to the Holy Land, and the church, the papacy, the church generally tended to win its disputes with the empire, and really kind of reduced and sort of just basically became the foremost temporal power. And again, that kind of goes back. You can trace that tendency quite a long way back. So if you look at sort of if you look into sort of the comparative the sort of comparative mythology, and the sort of the Indo-European sort of daughter societies, sort of which extend sort of across the ancient world, sort of ancient India, ancient Rome, and so on. You can see sort of there's always this priestly caste. So flamens they're called flamens in Rome, Brahmins in India, but again they're the top. They're the top of the caste hierarchy. So sort of clerical rule is quite ancient, not exactly universal, not universal, but sort of we have arguably it's the norm. It arguably been the norm for most of our history, and or at least we can say that the church was the foremost temporal power in the Middle Ages, and sort of we've just kind of been through a lot of developments that have created this new kind of clerical rule or clerical priestly class, which is based on a different ideology. Could you give me again
the
second question?
So the second question was, how did we come to get the current form of the clerical rule? How did we come to be ruled with a legitimizing ideology of, as say Keith Preston calls it, totalitarian humanism or progressivism? How does that fit in, and how does that arise to create the current way that the ruling class operates?
Okay, so as I mentioned, we were under a sort of European Christendom was dominated by a priestly class. Now, according to Moldbug, we're dominated by another progressive priestly class, and there's actually a direct connection between these two things. If you look at the book, and I think I cite this in a post from quite a while ago. Sort of Larry Siedentop, Inventing the Individual, actually makes the argument that liberalism, as we know it, which has now sort of developed into sort of liberal democracy, progressivism, sort of conservatism is another liberal ideology. So we've kind of got a choice. The choice between progressivism and conservatism nowadays is between two liberal ideologies, and the thesis of this book, Inventing the Individual, by Siedentop, is that it essentially evolved. This ideology kind of mimetically evolves out of the sort of the temporal power of the Catholic Church, and actually evolved from the Christian doctrine that the Church was responsible for all the souls of everyone under Christendom, and this doctrine of the soul then becomes the sort of, through various twists and turns. I'd have to go back to the book to see exactly how they twist and turn, but through various historical twists and turns and intellectual twists and turns, this becomes the theory of the theory of the individual and sort of individual rights. So essentially, yeah, and this is, of course, I think it's quite natural, because the priestly class sort of tells one of its main responsibilities is to tell the common people what to think, and the individual, which is sort of the theoretical basis of liberalism, is the sort of the kind of the lowest, smallest social unit, you could say. So it is kind of natural for a priestly class, a priestly ruling class, to appeal to this sort of social atom, and also to the common people. Okay, so does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's sort of a development of Christianity to some extent, and I think you mentioned in the post that you were referring to is that it was also used by various power interests to take away power from subordinates. So like the king will get the common people up against the nobles, so that you can take away power from some competing power centers, so you can centralize it while sort of try to enfranchise the individual. So yes, that does make sense. So we now have this current ruling demos and bureaucratic managerial state, or whatever terminology you wish to call it. I think we all have an idea of what it actually is. You have the concept in one of your essays of the black pill, that that basically there isn't but political action is going to be ultimately futile against the demos, and if anything, any political action as such is going to make things worse rather than actually improving the situation. So why should one be so black-pilled on the current states of affairs? And if one were to want to change the system, of any sort of political radical of any stripe would decide to want to move away from the bureaucratic managerial state, what forms of action could they take which would actually be productive?
Okay, so this idea of so I think I'm the one. I don't know if I'm the only one, but I don't see many people sort of making the case for the black pill. But definitely the idea of eschewing political action, again, that comes from Moldbug, and this is an idea that I really didn't like when I first encountered it, and kind of led to me unjustly overlooking a lot of what Moldbug had to say, because obviously when you see this ruling demos, as I call it, running Western civilization into the ground, you naturally want to do something. You want to do something about it, and you don't want to be told that you can't. But it does in fact make sense, and I think the events of the last 4 years have taught us that. I think in that, I think the main thing I would like to get across is I suppose the best way to look at it is it's not that political action is necessarily futile. Is necessarily always going to be futile, but that conservatism is futile. I think that's probably the most accessible way of looking at it. The sort of most acceptable way of looking at it, because the conservative, whether we're talking about the Republican Party in the US or the Conservative Party in the UK or whatever, it's a kind of I think Moldbug uses the term outer party and inner party, and he uses inner party for the left-wing progressive political party, and essentially the role of the conservative outer party is to mediate between the state and other power holders that are not really in the core of the state. So for corporations, the military, and also to serve their interests, to argue their case to the inner state, and to slow it down, act as a brake on it. But what you want, you don't want something that does that. We want to bring the whole thing to a stop. Okay, so engaging with conservatism is not the way to do that. And the idea of the black pill is essentially that if you try to go through this system, if you take seriously the idea that your vote grants you the right to you're wielding power when you vote, you can change your government if you get angry enough about it and mobilize enough people. What it has, we've what it does is contain dissident energy. So because there is a conservative outer party, dissidents have no way to they don't tend to go into the inner party, which is the thing that has the power. It sort of keeps sort of dissidents, sort of counter-revolutionaries in plain sight. It allows them to kind of sort of work off their feelings, doing this kind of fake. We've kind of gone through maybe two, maybe three. I would say two sort of fake reactions so far since this since the current form of government was established, sort of in the earlier mid 20th century. And sort of one of those would be the sort of the Thatcher Reagan reaction, the conservative reaction, and we're going through another one with Donald Trump and sort of associated movements elsewhere, such as Brexit. And what we find here, I mean, it really, I think it sort of makes, all it has really done is kind of pruned off sort of parts. It's kind of forced. So, for example, like the Thatcher government in the UK got rid of the trades union movement. Okay, but we're still it hasn't really sort of that's simply, if you look at sort of new left theorists in the 1960s, if you look at Marcuse, One Dimensional Man, if you look at that, he's already saying in that book that the sort of the native proletarians, the native proletariat of the West has become a conservative force, and now sort of the left has to look to sort of racial minorities, sexual minorities, women, etc., and kind of describing the kind of the new leftism that we are all too familiar with today. So really, the sort of what did the sort of this conservative reaction in the form of Margaret Thatcher do? Just sort of get rid. It just sort of got rid of a kind of holdover from the left, from the past of the left, and made it possible for a new, more malevolent form of leftism to just come into flower. With I'm just speaking of the UK here, but it holds true sort of across the West. And now, you know, I don't think we're even going to. I think with this latest sort of fake reaction in the form of Donald Trump, I don't think we're even going to be allowed to pretend that it's doing anything, because it's literally just kind of. But the point, to get back to the point I'm trying to make, okay. All the while we've kind of had high hopes. The right has kind of had very high hopes for everything it's done, as it's continued to vote conservative, as it's continued to try to create new parties, which invariably do not get very far. But all the time that it's been doing that, we've been essentially voting for the government. So that's quite a loss for us, I think, that sort of our concept of political action, our belief in the ideology of the state, our belief in democracy, has kind of caused us to do this. Has kind of we haven't achieved anything that we really wanted to achieve by it, but we've been voting for the government. If we see sort of the two political parties as simply two factions, an inner and outer faction of the government, we've been voting for the government all the time. So my suggestion is that we stop doing that, and that, unfortunately, the trade-off of that would be that there's no immediate way to get rid of this state. We're not going to vote it. We're not going to vote it out of office. We're not going to vote it out of power. But if it still gives us a choice, to consent to it, and I suggest that we withdraw that consent.
What would you say? What would be a positive program then for any dissident to undertake? Electoral politics is out, at least in general. Maybe you could make some pragmatic cases on a certain situations. What positive things could any dissidents do here and now to be able to further the hasten of the demise of the current order?
Right. So I have a post up on Affirmative Right, which is called the No Vote Movement, and this is an idea. This is an idea I came up with actually quite a while ago, in I think during the sort of the run up to the 2015 UK election. I was promoting the idea of just sort of persuading other people just not to vote for any party, to sort of try to sort of polarize the concept of voting between people who have, instead of having to sort of see the different parties as factions or representative factions of a single regime, and to sort of basically vote against them by not voting. So that's the kind of that would sort of require some sort of possibly require some kind of taking. It requires some work to get that message out to people, but I think it's one that can succeed. As for getting things done, I mean, it's going to be, it'll be a long sort of game, I think. But the one thing that what you find with sort of the alt-right and sort of the wider sort of dissident scene is that its activism doesn't tend to do any good. And activism, again, is it's another kind of democratic ritual. So when, for example, the approved leftist groups, for example BLM, Me Too, when they do activism, that's kind of like a screening force for power to be exercised by the state. When we do it, when the right tries to do activism, it's basically just the kulaks sort of proving how evil and horrible they are. To put it a little better, I mean, for example, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, a wave of violence was started by Antifa, and sort of attacking people in the streets. They'd been attacking Trump supporters in the run-up to the election, and the alt-right came out to meet them on the streets and fight them on the streets. And this, of course, culminated in the Charlottesville disaster, after which the alt-right was completely cracked down upon. An absolute tragedy. For in many ways, but the end result is that no one even remembers or very few people in terms of the normies remember the wave of Antifa violence after Donald Trump was elected. What they remember is that Donald Trump's evil right-wing kulak supporters came out and started doing violence on the streets, and the Antifa came and defeated them. And then fast forward to the BLM riots, the media was very keen on trying to sort of claim that sort of Boogaloo boys and shadowy sort of white supremacists were kind of committing all the violence in the shadows, but those people, they didn't turn up. So the media could point fingers, but they were constructing things basically from their imagination and pointing at shadows, because the right had kind of wised up by this point and they didn't show up. So this activism is not really working for us, but the sort of intellectual work and sort of red pilling people, that does in fact work. So that's the kind of thing we need to concentrate on, and I think what we will need to have is, most important thing to have is an alternative to what we need to have. We can't just sort of be endlessly complaining about the regime that we live under. We have to actually come up with an alternative, and some people, so pretty much Moldbug, again, is in a class of his own here, because he kind of is the only one who's really trying to go through the particulars of how you might have a regime change and create a different kind of government. But other people, I think, should sort of join that conversation. And finally, I think in terms of, instead of creating sort of new parties, which invariably will not get anywhere and will be co-opted and simply become the new Conservative Party, the new Com Party, if they were to ever get anywhere, I would say that the way, if we want power, we're going to have to get it through the we're going to have to get it by through the inner party, basically. And sort of whether sort of dissidents, sort of counter-revolutionaries, anti-democrats, whatever, whether or not they could take control of that party, whether or not they could take control of the sort of what we currently think of the left. I think when it's a one-party state, basically when conservatism is a thing of the past, based on the history of sort of previous revolutions, sort of the previous revolutionary regimes, the French Revolution, which ended up with Napoleon, and ended up with Thermidor and then Napoleon, the Russian Revolution, which again sort of became more conservative, became conservative after Stalin, and sort of ended up as a generic Russian empire with a very sort of inefficient economic system. And also the Chinese Communist Party, also after the Cultural Revolution, basically this was taken over by a sort of a relatively conservative leader, Deng Xiaoping, who went on to kind of create the kind of non-revolutionary sort of communist in all but name China that we know today. So obviously, if sort of dissidents want to sort of go into politics, it's going to have to be in the party that really has the power. But it's sort of unclear how that would work. I think sort of a worthwhile goal to sort of definitely would be, I think, to mobilize the anger that people are feeling right now against the sort of conservative establishment, and sort of destroy the sort of the conservative, the sort of the fake alternative, the good cop, so to speak. I think that would be a good immediate goal to aim for. But that may be daunting to some people who would fear the consequences, the short-term consequences of doing that. So,
thank you, James, for joining us. That's a very interesting conversation. James is one of the writers in the fight at the moment, and so whenever he's out on affirmative right, I would suggest reading them. Just now, I'd like to thank everyone who enjoyed this. Please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on YouTube. Finally, if you would like to contact us, ideas for the show, comments, say to us, contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com, mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.